And so, with that, how many of you are familiar with theology of the body? At least sort of know what it is. Okay. One of the issues with theology of the body is it's pretty dense. Like it was 129 different papal addresses, Wednesday general audience from like 1979 to about 1984, 85. Um, and so John Paul II really gets into the weeds of human love, sexuality, and how it sort of relates to our destiny, and how we live here and now. And so most people are familiar with it, but it can be difficult to understand. And one of the reasons why it can be difficult to understand is because um, I think there's certain prerequisites that you have to sort of dive through in order to understand it. And one of the prerequisites is Humanae Vitae. And the reason for that is basically because when Paul the Sixth, St. Paul the Sixth, issued Humanae Vitae, a week later in his general audience. So if you read, how many of you have read Humanae Vitae or at least know what it is? Okay, um, so we'll talk about it in a second, but one of the things that Humanae Vitae is it's really short. And he doesn't necessarily give a whole lot of arguments for the church's position. He just kind of reiterates them, and then sort of takes them in a different direction. And we'll talk about that direction in a minute. But he recognized that this was an area that the church needed to sort of further work through and further sort of study and explain. And so this is what he said, and right after he released the encyclical, he said, the encyclical has clarified a fundamental chapter in the field of marriage, family, and morality. So sort of an authoritative statement. He gives will ultimately be a natural law reasoning, but he feels like, and this is one of the criticisms of it, is that there needed to be more work in it. And so he says, still, the magisterium of the church could and perhaps should return to this immense field with a fuller, more organic, and more synthetic treatment. And at the time, there was a cardinal in Poland who actually had a pretty profound effect on Paul VI. He was part of the Papal Commission on Birth Control, but Paul VI had also read John Paul II's book, which was called Love and Responsibility, which is one of the things we'll talk about this semester. And so, in a certain way, and providentially, the future John Paul II was up to the task. And when he gets sort of to the end of Theology of the Body, he just essentially says the whole purpose of this was to reread Humanae Vitae. And so what he wanted to do was go deeper and explain it. And so Theology of the Body is essentially meant to sort of fill in the gaps of the arguments that Humanae Vitae is making. So a little bit about Humanae Vitae, just in general. It was released on July 25th, 1968, and it landed in the church like a bomb. It's probably the most controversial and hated encyclical in sort of church history. And it's also the one that very few people have actually read. But we were talking, Parker and I, before we started. The day after the encyclical was released, a group of priests in the New York Times took out a full-page ad, essentially debunking Humanae Vitae, saying that it wasn't authoritative, it was wrong, and so forth and so on. And this coming from a time when nobody had seen the encyclical. It wasn't like they could go on the Vatican website and read it. This was just because everyone was expecting the church's teaching to change, because the whole world had changed the way they viewed contraception. And so there is probably no teaching in the church that's more controversial and more people dissent from. And at the heart of it, very often, it actually, I think, starts people down the road of dissent. So they had difficulty accepting it as hard teaching, and we're going to talk about why it's hard teaching. But part of the purpose of Humanae Vitae was to give us motivation to live out that hard teaching. Um, and so again, what then tended to happen was, once you sort of reject the church's authority in one area, you sort of start going down the line and essentially becoming, Protestant within the confines of the church. And that sort of is what happened. Okay. And so we're going to talk more about a little bit about the history of it. First, I just want to sort of lay out the logic of the semester with the dates. Obviously, today is the first one. And then next week, we'll talk about love and responsibility, which I already mentioned is sort of I think, the necessary background information to understand theology of the body. And it sort of starts with John Paul II was what's called a personalist philosophy, which what a personalist does, at least in the Christian sense, is he takes some objective truth about human nature, and then we'll look at an experience and show how it maps to that objective truth, right? So, classic example, what he does in theology about, he looks at the experience of shame. Yes, I did. Somebody asked for it.
There's some chairs downstairs.
There's some shows that I love.
That's Alex's office, so they start on.
I seem to remember telling him I wouldn't forget about him. The very first time, you know what I did? I totally forgot about him. I was like, I'll never forget about you. Okay. I didn't forget. I promise. Okay, so love and responsibility. So John Paul II, we're talking about his sort of philosophy. He has what's called a personalist, and so what he does is try to take human experience and map it back to what we know about human nature, right? And so you'll see this comes out first in Love and Responsibility, where he looks at, for example, he looks at attraction, like what actually makes you attracted to someone of the opposite sex, what draws you to them, and what he sort of tries to help us grasp is what it is that draws, and then what our fallen nature causes us to do, and then how to sort of redeem it. And he does similar things in Theology of the Body with the experience of shame. And so Love and Responsibility is a good way to sort of get introduced to his style. And it's, in my opinion, a little more accessible than the Theology of the Body, in the sense that he's really just dealing with practical issues, and not necessarily deep theological issues too. It was written mostly for married couples. And so it's pretty accessible. And so from there, we'll dive into the theology of the body, and it's broken up essentially into the sort of three experiences of man: original man, that is before the fall; historical man, so the here and now, so both prior to redemption and living in a time of redemption. Eschatological man is the life after the resurrection, after the general resurrection. And then once we sort of hammer home the sort of our identity, he talks about what do you do about it, right? So then he talks about celibacy for the kingdom, the sacramentality of marriage, love and fruitfulness. And then the last session is, okay, I learned all this, like, what is it? What difference does this make? What difference does it make for me personally? And then what difference does it make to the world, right? So one of the papal biographers, George Weigel, he called theology of the body a theological time bomb that was scheduled to go off in some point in the 21st century. So he thought it was so important. And the reason I think it is so important is because we are living in a culture where there's just a mass identity crisis. And uh, and part of that identity crisis is like if you don't know where you came from, it's really difficult to know who you are or where you're going, right? And the second piece of the identity crisis is we don't even know what it means to be a man or a woman, right? And he answers both of those questions, and so I think it's relevant to what's going on. Okay. All right. So any questions on the schedule or just the sort of general background? All right. So let's sort of frame the historical context of it because it'll help us sort of understand at least the questions that it asks. I don't necessarily want to go too deeply into this, but it is at least helpful to sort of grasp what was going on. So, in many ways, World War II changed sexual morality in the United States. And one of the reasons was like soldiers went off to Europe and found prostitutes, and women were home by themselves without necessarily men to marry. And so sexual morality definitively changed. But it also became a public health issue. Okay. Because when you sort of have people sleeping around, you also have venereal diseases. And so once that happened, there was more of a discussion in sort of and a more of an openness to something like a contraceptive pill, right? And so you sort of compound that with the rise of what was called the Birth Control League, which was started by Margaret Sanger. Margaret Sanger is the Birth Control League became Planned Parenthood. And what she was looking for was a way to sort of liberate sex from marriage. And in order to do that, you would have to liberate it from procreation. And one of the ways she did that, she was pretty manipulative. She would gather these stories, horror stories, of women having, 6, 7, 8 kids living in a 2-room apartment, all under the age of 8. And so she had a whole book of these letters that were supposedly written to her called Motherhood in Bondage. And up here as an example, I was married when I was 17 and I'm now 28. I have 4 living children and 2 miscarriages. My last child is 9 months old. I had no doctor for 2 hours after she was born and only the assistance of a neighbor. I laid on the bathroom floor until they could get a doctor and nearly got blood poison. And I'm still suffering from milk leg. I'm not really sure what that is as a result of my last baby's birth. Is there much use, dear Margaret Sanger, in living for people like me? I have the fear of pregnancy on my mind all the time. If I try to stay away from my husband, he is terrible, mean to me, and says awful things to me. He doesn't seem to think that I have suffered having my babies and what a terrible worry it is when they are sick, and how hard it is to make over old clothing, and I don't know what else. For God's sake, please help me with your knowledge, so I need not have any more, as I have heart trouble, and I would like to be here and raise these 4 than to have more and maybe die. All right, so in the midst of this, right, so the culture is sort of saturated with this. The church becomes the bad guy, right? Yes.
Is this like, are you implying that these are forged by her?
No, I'm not implying. I'm just saying I don't know where they came from, right? Like,
Okay,
I mean, what I am saying though is, and we'll talk about this later, it's not that she doesn't have a point, right? Like the state of marriage at this time isn't good. There are plenty of husbands who are using their wives as baby making factories. And so this is why it's important that the church address that, right? I don't know whether, I don't know whether she made these up or not. It's odd to have a whole book of these. But nevertheless, I'm not accusing her of anything. The point is that appeals to emotion are often really strong, right? And so when you're you see all these stories, you immediately begin to think, well, we have to do something, right? We have to do something. And so that's what's going on in the culture, right? And so what Margaret Sanger does, her second marriage, she married into money. And so she funded a Harvard researcher who was working on a birth control pill. And then as they got closer, they got a drug company, Searle, involved, and they got another Catholic doctor named John Rock to help. And so eventually in the 50s, we see the release of the birth control pill. And so that's sort of where we are culturally, right? So, and in the midst of all of this, you even see Pius XII was already saying that, it wasn't listed to use the birth control pill. But nevertheless, the church has to respond because with stories like this, true or exaggerated or whatever, that it's a legitimate issue that needs to be addressed. And so the church has to respond. Compounded by this is the fact that from ancient times, the church, until 1930, every Christian denomination condemned the use of contraception. All right, so there were laws in the United States called Comstock laws that essentially made contraception illegal. Once the Anglican Church, which meets every 10 years in Lambeth, once they came up with a sort of a loophole, it sort of opened Pandora's box. And now it became a question of not if Christians could use contraception, but when they should. Okay. And so it's sort of in this atmosphere then that the church begins to respond. And the first response comes this same year, 1930, with Casti Connubii by Pope Pius XI. And he again reiterates the church's teaching. Since therefore, openly departing from the uninterrupted Christian tradition, some recently have judged it possible solemnly to declare another doctrine regarding this question, the Catholic Church, to whom God has entrusted the defense of the integrity and purity of morals, standing erect in the midst of the moral union which surrounds her, in order that she may preserve the chastity of the nuptial union from being defiled by this foul stain, raises her voice in token of her divine ambassadorship, and through our mouth proclaims anew any use whatsoever of matrimony exercised in such a way that the act is deliberately frustrated in its natural power to generate life is an offense against the law of God and of nature, and those who indulge in such are branded with the guilt of grave sin. Okay, so
would the way that that's worded indicate an infallible declaration?
Maybe. I mean, it's way clearer. Like if you look at Humanae Vitae, that it's infallible. The fact that he says something about uninterrupted Christian tradition would lend itself to the argument that it's an infallible teaching. And so this is where it's a good time to sort of talk about church authority. Okay. So this is not obviously the first time the church has spoken on the question of contraception, right? But if you read Casti Connubii, you will look at it and you'll say, okay, he's saying this, but how do I know? Okay, it's part of the uninterrupted Christian tradition. Right? And this is where it's really important when you read church documents to look at the footnotes. All right, so authority almost always rests in the footnotes in Catholic documents, because what it does is it sets up the chain of reasoning, right? And so when you look at Casti Connubii, you'll notice I think the most often cited document is from Leo XIII in 1883 called Arcanum, in which he does the same thing, where he looks at Christian tradition, specifically St. Augustine and Gregory IX, and again reiterates that the church has always condemned the use of contraception. So the way that we should read this, and it's important when we get to Humanae Vitae, right, is the reason why it's important to look at the footnotes is because with the church, teaching doesn't change, right? But it's always going to expand in a direction, right? And it's going to expand in a way that's comprehensible to the culture in which it's being released, right? And so we'll see as we get into Humanae Vitae that he's specifically speaking to modern life, right? And so he's saying, okay, here is the traditional teaching. It has not changed. Here it is in the footnote. Okay, but what in modern life has changed that makes the application of this teaching different? Okay, and so, for example, right, like one of the criticisms of Humanae Vitae is nowhere in there does he ever say that the end of marriage is the procreation and education of children, right, which is the constant teaching of the church. And everyone's like, well, look, he's trying to change the teaching. He never said this, except it's in all the footnotes, right? And so that didn't need to be said again. And in fact, part of the reason why Humanae Vitae was written was to make that more understandable because it was a source of confusion. And so the point is that in order to fully understand the church's teaching on anything, you have to sort of trace back that chain. And then the same thing when you go to Humanae Vitae, there's something like 41 footnotes and seven or eight of them are to Cassie Canubi. Okay. So the point is that different historical periods require us to sort of expand the teaching. Okay. All right. So all that is all background information. And this is to sort of just answer Andrew's question regarding, okay, is this an infallible teaching? So when a teaching is reiterated throughout tradition, and when you see something like words like the uninterrupted Christian tradition, all right, that is what is called an exercise of the ordinary magisterium, all right? And in doing so, it's to be considered an infallible statement, all right? And so such a doctrine can be confirmed or reaffirmed by the Roman Pontiff, even without recourse to a solemn definition. So not every time that the Pope makes a solemn definition, not every time that the Pope says something that's infallible, does it have to be solemnly defined that way? Okay. So he can refer to previously held uninterrupted traditional teaching, or he can refer to the natural law. All right, and we'll talk about why the natural law is infallible in a second. So I think Casti Canubi falls under the sort of the ordinary magisterium in what it's saying. And I don't think it really matters because I think it's pretty clear that Humanae Vitae is an infallible teaching of the church. And so, of course, anything that agreed with Humanae Vitae would also be infallible. All right, any questions on ordinary magisterium? I think we've talked about it before, but just to make sure it's clear. Yes.
I've heard a lot of people claim that ordinary magisterium is binding but infallible. It's not infallible, so it's fine on their conscience, but it's not infallible. What's the source of data for that?
Yeah, so it's this what is on the screen, but there's also Lumen Gentium, I think is 25. Also talks about the manner in which it can be. So people will use that term, it might be what you're saying. We'll use the term ordinary magisterium in two different sort of contexts, right? They'll say ordinary magisterium as if it's just a teaching of the church. Like the Pope is just exercising his magisterium and just teaching something. And that's one way in which people use it. It's when it's also in where it's been sort of reiterated over and over and over is what then makes that exercise of ordinary magisterium infallible. So not all exercises of ordinary magisterium are infallible, but when it is repeated over and over and over, it becomes infallible.
So maybe this was just a different idea. I heard that was called superordinary magisterium, which is when it's been exercised multiple times.
Yeah, I mean that's the idea. I don't know that I necessarily heard that term, but that would be the idea. So I think you're right what you're saying, but I think in the terms that Lumen Gentium uses, ordinary magisterium can be an infallible exercise or not.
Or not.
Oh.
What is CDF?
So that's the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith.
That like people or maybe
Yeah, so that is part of the dicastery of the, so not to get us like too in the weeds, but they can issue authoritative statements with the permission of the Pope.
Are those the same people who made the shaking Alexandria document?
I don't know. I don't know that I'm familiar with those.
Or they don't have that?
I mean, it's a relatively new, like that idea is relative. It's only in the 20th century that they started doing that. And then there's different degrees of authority, and which we can certainly talk about at some point if you want. Okay. All right. Any other questions? Okay. All right. So let's now sort of dive into the document itself. Okay. So Paul VI says this kind of question, he's talking about the question related to the use of contraception, requires from the teaching authority of the church a new and deeper reflection on the principles of the moral teaching on marriage, a teaching which is based on the natural law as illuminated and enriched by divine revelation. No member of the faithful could possibly deny that the church is competent in her magisterium to interpret the natural law. In carrying out this mandate, the church has always issued appropriate documents on the nature of marriage, the correct use of conjugal rights, and the duties of spouses. Okay, so let's talk about why a new and deeper reflection is required. So what made the pill different? Does anyone know? Like what? I mean,
Like, because it's affecting your hormones.
yes. Okay, so what from a moral perspective would make it different?
Did it reverse what already happened?
Well, I mean, it could reverse what already happened. Yes, that's a different issue, but yes.
Is it like having pretending a miscarriage is about to happen over and over again to prevent a pregnancy?
I mean, that's kind of how it works. But my question is more from the moral front. Like, how would we even begin to evaluate this morally? Andrew is chomping at the bit behind you. Go ahead, Andrew.
It was like the first time I was involved in contraception, and it actually prevent fertile conception and fertilization. It just, I mean, it tends to do that, but it also means that if that doesn't happen, they just prevent that from happening. Your slide suggests, which effectively also makes it really efficient.
Yes. Yeah. So Andrew got out a little ahead of me, but what makes it different is that it doesn't change the act itself physically. Okay. So understand why this is a big deal, right? So like a woman using a diaphragm or a man using a condom, something physically changed in the act. What made this difficult to sort of grasp is that the physical act itself doesn't change because the woman doesn't do anything different during the act. It's before the act even happens. Okay. And so the question becomes okay, is that all right? Right. So this is why the church has to now begin to answer this question, because it's, again, how do we take what the church has always taught and apply it to this sort of new mechanism in which the person doesn't actually do anything to change the act during the act itself. Okay. And so that's what the big question is.
So was it,
Go ahead.
sorry, Rob. Does it have something to do with they were talking about matrimony and matrimony and matrimony, and now they're like, oh, okay, well, matrimony is really concerned about the act, but the act isn't really changing. This happens after the fact, so that what basis do we, disapprove of this on?
Yeah, so not that it's happening, what happens actually is before the act, right? So the woman taking the pill is what sort of where the morality hits. Now it acts, which we're going to talk about in a second. It acts after the act as well, right? But
was this pill was the first pill that came out taken before or after?
no, so this was taken before.
Oh, it was before. Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
I was thinking.
Yeah, so it's not like the RU 486. It wasn't like the morning after pill.
Okay.
That was developed pretty quickly afterwards. This one was different in the sense that they would take it every morning. And
like pretty standard. Okay.
Yep.
Got it. Okay. All right.
Yeah, the fact that you don't know how it works actually makes me edified. That's good.
Yeah, I'd like to consider myself pretty ignorant.
Yeah, I'll take that as a good thing. Okay. Anyway, but I am going to talk about how it works because it's important. Um, the reason why it's important is because of how it works, and this is what Andrew was sort of hinting at. Okay, so how it works is it inhibits ovulation. All right. It also changes the cervical mucus so that it's harder for the sperm to meet the egg, and it changes the uterine lining, so that a fertilized egg cannot attach to the endometrium. All right. The first two are, in a certain sense, contraceptive, right? Stopping fertilization. What's the third one? It's an abortion, right? That's the definition of an abortion, right? It's taking a child that has been conceived and making it so that the child cannot implant. All right. And so every birth control pill, all of them on the market, are all abortifacients. All right. And so any sort of discussion about, and we won't necessarily go down that route, the principle of double effect with the pill are null and void. Okay. Because it can cause an abortion. Okay. And so this is why, you know, one, I mean, a couple of things. So, this is why you can't necessarily be, well, not necessarily, you cannot be pro-life and pro-contraception. Yes.
But would that make it like intrinsically wrong to take at any time?
Yeah. So anyone who is, there are cases where, this is medically a really bad idea, but where a woman might take it who isn't sexually active, but to control her hormones. And in that case, morally, it's not necessarily wrong as long as she's not sexually active. But for anyone who is sexually active, it would always be wrong to use the pill. Because in this case, you don't know which of the three mechanisms are at play. It just does all three things, right? And so in choosing to use the pill, you are in essence choosing the effects of it as well. Okay, so this is not very well known, and I would say most people probably act out of ignorance and have no idea. But it's also why, in truth, you will probably never see a declaration from some legislature about life beginning at conception.
Can you elaborate?
Yeah, because if life begins at conception, they have to do away with the birth control pill, right? Because it can no longer be used.
Are you gonna elaborate?
Yeah, so yeah, again, not to necessarily go deeper into this, but you literally have like sex hormone receptors all over your body, and most especially in your brain, right? And so while there might be a targeted effect of the pill, what it does to a woman is horrible. She essentially feels like she's pregnant all the time, because her body thinks she's pregnant all the time. And not to be like, I mean, it's easy for me to say as a guy, and I guess there's somebody who's pregnant in the room, but anyone who's been around their wife when she's pregnant knows that they're usually totally ditzy, and it's because their brains are not working correctly because of all the hormones. Okay, all right. So at least Ryan admits it. Yeah, at least Ryan admits it. But I do remember you telling me about pregnancy brain.
I have, so for your hormones, the woman's body throughout the course of her cycle has a bunch of them, but there are about 4 main ones that go in all sorts of different ways and patterns depending on the time of the point in the cycle. What the pill does is essentially kind of flatline some of those, so your body does think it's pregnant. Eventually, there are, I don't remember the number, somewhere between like 5-ish, around 5 days a month where the pills the woman is just supposed to take it every day. It's basically a sugar pill, which allows your body to just kind of crash. The hormones crash. That's the point where you're saying where the woman's body essentially goes through what seems like a miscarriage. which is where you get a lot of these, like women who are on the pill have a lot of like kind of mood disorders, anxiety, depression, that type of thing. Because when you think you're going through an abortion in your body, whether or not you like cognitively think it, thinks you're going through a miscarriage every month, like that messes you up. Along with all the other stuff, but pregnancy, it depends.
Yeah.
There's some other interesting facts too, like how because of the change in hormones and actually modulates what a woman looks for in a partner. So a lot of women look like there. I mean, there are stereotypes and such.
Yeah.
But typically, women who are on the pill like pursue by like men who are less masculine, because of like the way that their brain chemistry is altered. And there's actually a lot of there's like a growing social movement to like get off the pill,
Yeah.
especially some of the other like adverse medical effects from that. There's a lot of women like stop using alcohol. I know that they're like no longer actually all attractive percent of the way. It's like just a based on and a phenomenon.
Yeah, if you're interested in it, there's a book called I would not recommend necessarily. The author is pretty well, let's just say morally probably would not agree with what she says, but she's a doctor and she has a book called This Is Your Brain on the Pill. And that's worth reading if you really want to sort of understand the chemical changes that happen to the women. And our whole argument is like no one ever told us this.
Jason Everett also has a podcast that's exploring in one of his earlier episodes. It's all about the ability of a couple, which would probably be easier to read.
What were you gonna ask?
It's like, when was it the original forms of contraception like that affected the act? Like, when were they removed and why? Exactly.
You mean what removed? In what way? What do you mean?
Like condoms and other forms. Like, why? What was the reasoning for that exactly?
I mean, it'll be the same reasoning when we get to come back to it. But you mean when the church?
Because like I can understand the abortive part that you're destroying a soul as being in you, right? And I can see them, but like, why the other parts? Like, what was that based on?
Okay, yeah. So we're going to talk about that. That's what we're talking about now. All right. So in order to sort of answer your question, though, we have to back up to look at the argument and we have to talk about natural law. Okay. How many of you are familiar with the natural law? Okay, so I'm going to give like a little crash course in the natural law just for us to sort of grasp what's going on. All right. Okay, so the idea is this. Okay, so you can look at human nature, and because human nature is fixed, right, there's certain things that cause human nature to thrive and certain things which do not. All right, so there are certain things that are good for human nature and certain things that are not, right? And in a certain sense, right, those things that are good, we have a desire for, right? And those things that are not, we are sort of repulsed by, okay? So that being said, right, because we are rational creatures, we have this capacity to look at ourselves and choose between what is good and what is bad, all right? What is good for us and what is bad. And so we have this capacity to discover moral truths. And so this natural law is essentially our capacity to look at ourselves and know certain things about us. Okay. And so sometimes people will sort of get confused with natural law and they'll think, well, like laws of nature, like things out like, oh, animals act this way. We're talking about something totally different. We're talking about human nature, and we're talking about what is morally good and what is morally wrong. All right. Okay, so how do we know those things? All right. So as I said, it's basically by looking at ourselves. All right, and we find that there are four sort of basic human goods, four sort of desires that are self-evident. All right, and as I name these, you will sort of agree. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. All right. So the first thing is we always act to preserve our being. All right. So life. The second thing is we have a natural inclination or natural desire for marriage. And with that, because we are rational creatures, bringing up and educating children. And third is we are naturally social beings. All right, so we have this natural inclination to live in society. And the way we know that is we have an ability to speak, right? And speak and talk and share ideas and communicate. And that pushes us towards this understanding of that we are social beings, right? And the fourth is that we have a knowledge of the truth. All right, we have this desire to know the truth, and especially about God. All right. And so we have these four things, okay? These four natural goods, right? Anything that promotes these four things is morally good. Anything that frustrates these four things is morally bad. All right. Yes.
But yeah, I get that, but St. Thomas Aquinas wasn't like he didn't pursue marriage. So like what if the church was frustrating number two?
Yeah. So okay, so this is a great question. Okay. So naturally there are situations where you choose one good, it will frustrate another one, right? So I stand up and say something that's true and somebody kills me. Right. So there's a pecking order to these, in that the ones that are, that's why they're in the order they are. The ones that are lower on the list are higher goods. And they're higher because more people participate in them. So you can forego one of the lower numbered ones for the sake of the other ones. Right. So somebody who, an army officer who goes and protects society and gives his life, he hasn't done anything wrong. Right, because he's contributed to the common good, more people.
What you're saying is 4 is number 1.
4 is the highest good because more. So the way that St. Thomas will always rank goods is it will depend on the number of people that can share in them. Right. So yes.
Does fasting not impede number one, but not contribute to any of the other ones?
It would contribute to number 4.
Fasting contributes to knowledge fruit.
And you have to create two as well.
So, I mean, depending on why you're doing it, you can also contribute to 3 as well, right? So in other words, you could be doing it you're doing it as penance for other people.
Elijah fasted to know God's.
So ultimately, why would you fast? What's the reason for fasting?
In the context I've read mostly from Saint Fathers, the purpose of it is to discipline the will and pursue the virtue of self-control. I don't see how that would fit those quarters at.
Well, it would be that would be knowledge of the truth, right? So in other words, because you are a fallen creature, right? Because you are a fallen creature, and you cannot live in the truth, you have to make sacrifices in order to. And now I would say, to flip that around though, normally to fast and put your life in jeopardy would be wrong, right? So you're not necessarily sacrificing the first, like you shouldn't be sacrificing the first before in that case, but it is a higher good because the disciplining of the soul would be better than the disciplining of the body, which is the truth, right? So, and I do think, going back to, now that I sort of understand where you're coming from and what they're saying, I think it would in most cases be wrong to fast and put your health in jeopardy, right?
It's to frustrate, as in like intentionally stop versus forgo, like to sacrifice something. Are two different things.
Fasting generally doesn't kill you.
Yeah. Yeah, and in a lot of ways, it actually helps bodily health, right? Like they're coming to see that too, right?
When Christ fasted for 40 days, that's like hardly fast.
Yeah, I mean, there's a good argument that was probably a miracle anyway, right? Like, I mean, I think there's in church history, there's plenty of examples of, saints that, like Saint Catherine of Siena lived for like 3 years on the Eucharist, right? So there's just like, those are miraculous sort of interventions. But yeah, so, okay, so back to my point, about, okay, so how we determine something is wrong, right? So why is lying wrong? Yes, because it harms 3 and 4, right? Deliberately frustrates 3 and 4. Why is murder wrong? Deliberately frustrates 1, right? Probably 3 as well, and probably 4 as well for the dignity of a person, right? Why is contraception wrong?
That's all.
Well, if and in essence, it frustrates number 2 and number 3, which we'll see why in a minute, and number 4, right? And if we use the pill, it actually frustrates number 1. Okay, so the point is, right, this is how we can begin to talk about morality, right? Notice I didn't invoke anything about God in this, right? So natural law is accessible by reason alone, right? And so, and these arguments will tend to be convincing to people as well, right? And so this is why I said earlier, when you can make a natural law argument because it's based on human nature not changing, that can be an infallible declaration, right? And so it is always wrong to frustrate the good of marriage. Yes.
I think natural law is unchanging.
Natural laws, well, because human nature is unchanging. Yes.
Does NFB do number frustrate number 2?
No, and we'll talk about why in a minute. Okay. All right. Any questions on this? Because it's sort of just grasping this. Again, we're not necessarily have to go deep into it, but understanding this is sort of help us get what he sort of gets at. Okay. Okay. All right. So let's now sort of back up. I'm going to back up to Casti Canubi and just talk about, because one of the objections is that I said earlier that Paul VI never really sort of talked about the end of marriage being the procreation and education of children. All right. So when I want to know what something is, so I want to define something, how do I do that? How do you define a something? So I encounter something, I have no idea what it is, but I want to know what it is. What's the first thing you do?
Describe it.
Just maybe
Observe it.
observe. So yes, observe it because you want to see what it does, right? Because usually in seeing what a thing does, you can now take a step back to sort of know what it is, right? And so, and this is very much the way St. Thomas would do things. You would look at a thing and I want to know what the thing is. I first look and see what it does. All right. So if I want to know what an eye is, first I see what it does. I want to know what an ear is, first I see what it does, right? And then I can eventually back up to a definition. All right. And so for a long time, the church didn't necessarily define what marriage is, but focus more on what marriage does. And that's why it talks about the end of marriage, right? What it does, what it's for, right? So I'm looking at this thing and I'm like, okay, what do all of these things have in common and what did they do? And what they had in common was that they were ordered to the procreation and education of children. Okay, so you will often see that language in church documents about the primary end of marriage is the procreation and education of children. Yes.
So if someone like was getting married and didn't have that in mind, like didn't want to have kids, would that make the marriage invalid?
Yes, well, for a couple of reasons, yes. But the first is that part of your vow, right, is that you will lovingly and openly accept children, right? But to sort of anticipate the flip side of that question is there are certainly situations like, you know, 2 70-year-olds get married, right? They're not going to have children, right? But that doesn't mean that they don't have a true marriage, right? So just because they don't fulfill,
But they're still, I guess they would still be like, still open, but not like, but not having kids.
yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
that's
so-
what it would be.
So the analogy would be like, you know, what is the end of a soldier? What's his purpose? To fight in a war. If he doesn't fight in a war, is he a soldier still? Yes, because he's ordered to fight in a war, right? So same thing here. All right. So just grasping that, just understanding that is important to understand the language and understand that there's no contradiction between what we're about to talk about in this, okay? So what Paul VI wanted to do now is back up from that language of end, and start talking about the meaning itself. All right, so start to begin to have a definition, okay? And start to look at the nature of marriage and not just what marriage does. All right, and so here's what he says. The sexual activity in which husband and wife are intimately and chastely united with one another, through which human life is transmitted, is, as the recent council recalled, noble and worthy. It does not, moreover, cease to be legitimate, even when, for reasons independent of their will, it is foreseen to be infertile. Okay, so that's everything we just said. For its natural adaptation to the expression and strengthening of the union of husband and wife is not thereby suppressed. The fact is, as experience shows, that new life is not the result of each and every act of sexual intercourse. God has wisely ordered laws of nature and the incidence of fertility in such a way that successive births are already naturally spaced through the inherent operation of these laws. The Church, nevertheless, in urging men to the observance of the precepts of the natural law, teaches that each and every marital act must of necessity retain its intrinsic relationship to the procreation of human life. All right, so there's a lot there. Let's just sort of unpack it. All right, so the first part we already talked about. Second part is he's sort of setting up an understanding of men are fertile all the time. Hopefully, I'm not telling you something you don't already know. Women are only fertile a certain amount of time during the month. Okay. So the fact that there are natural periods of infertility in the woman lends itself to the truth that not every act of the marital embrace has to, well, both end infertility, but also that the couple need not intend for the act to end up with a child. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, so he's just looking at God's design. He's like, God designed it this way. Okay. Now, because God designed it that way, doesn't then mean that we can extend that period, which is essentially what the pill does. So extend that period of infertility. All right. So what he's essentially saying is that we can do nothing to inhibit fertilization from occurring. All right. So again, like, this may be obvious, but it's worth thinking about. So when a couple engages in the marital embrace, she doesn't get pregnant immediately, right? So in fact, fertilization happens after the act. All right. And so in a certain sense, it is out of the control of the couple. Okay. Like whether sperm meets egg or not is totally out of control of the couple, right? And so what he's saying is that every act has to be ordered to that type of act that will result in fertilization, even though not every act will end up in fertilization. And we can do nothing to inhibit that. Right? Does that make sense? Okay. And so that's the sort of natural law reasoning he's using. All right. So again, he didn't invoke necessarily God or and so you'll often hear people sort of use the term open to life or open to fertility. And that's where it comes from. This particular doctrine, often expounded by the magisterium of the church, is based on the inseparable connection established by God, which man, on his own initiative, may not break, between the unitive significance and the procreative significance, which are both inherent to the marriage act. Okay, so that's important what he's saying. He's saying the marital embrace has a meaning to it, and these two things, that it is both unitive and procreative, and you cannot separate those two things. All right, so every act has to be both unitive and ordered to procreation. All right, and we'll talk about why that is in a second. The reason is that the fundamental nature of the marriage act, while uniting husband and wife in closest intimacy, so it's unitive, also renders them capable of generating new life. And this as a result of the laws written into the actual nature of man and of woman. And if each of these essential qualities, the unitive and procreative, is preserved, the use of marriage fully retains its sense of true mutual love and its ordination to the supreme responsibility of parenthood, to which man is called. All right, so he's saying in order to be a true act of love and to truly unite the couple, it must be procreative in nature. All right, why? So there is that problem, which is sort of the personalist argument, right? But what if I say, like, what if we both agree to being used? Like a lot of people say, like a lot of people think that way, and I'm not saying it's a good way to think. I'm just saying that,
You're disordered.
I mean, that is disordered. I don't know that I would turn and say, hey, you're disordered. Say that again.
Love is meant to be.
Yes, love is meant to be fruitful. Okay, so what I want you to begin to think about is the fact that you cannot actually be unitive without being procreative. And we'll talk about why that is in just a second. So in other words, they actually can't be separated. Sorry, wrong direction. Okay. All right, so I'm going to sort of read this explanation and then we'll unpack it because I think it's important. Okay, so as I'm reading this, think about the fact that marriage is supposed to be a one flesh communion, right? And that's supposed to be literal. Okay. All right, so here's the sort of here's the sort of argument. Though a male and female are complete individuals with respect to other functions, for example, nutrition, sensation, locomotion, with respect to reproduction, they are only potential parts of a mated pair, which is the complete organism capable of reproducing sexually. Even if the mated pair is sterile, intercourse, provided it is the reproductive behavior characteristic of the species, makes the copulating male and female one organism. All right, so what did he just say?
That the purpose of it is for procreation, not for gratification.
Well, he did say that the purpose of it was, but he's saying something more, actually. He's saying that you can't actually be united unless you're what? Also performing something procreative, right? Because otherwise, right, you're not acting as one unit. You're not acting as one flesh. You're not acting as one thing. All right, and this is really important to grasp because, especially if you're going to talk to other people about this that sort of don't grasp the church's teaching, this is a very effective way to talk to people because if they're open to it, like I've had discussions with atheists about this and referred to this, and they grasp it. They grasp it. They're like, well, what if we just want to show love to each other, but we don't want to get pregnant? And it's actually not a uniting act unless it's ordered towards procreation, because that's the only kind of way in which two can become one. Right? And if you can grasp this, then you can begin to grasp why masturbation is wrong, why homosexual activity is wrong, why any other act besides the marital grace, even in marriage, is wrong. Okay, because that's the only way that you can actually become one with the other person, right? And so they cannot be separated. So a contraceptive act is not unitive either. Right? Yes.
So is it like you're rejecting the other person? Like you want to be with them, but you don't want to be enough with them to become a person together?
Yes, and that's exactly what it is, right? So in other words, the meaning of your act is that I love you unconditionally. I want to be part of you. But the act itself is saying, I like all of you, but your fertility. Right? And so in a certain sense, it becomes like a mutual act of masturbation rather than an act of true love. Now, does that make sense? Because that is the crux of the argument. Okay, and that would be why it's wrong, because it's not even an act of love any longer, right? It's just an act of mutual use, to Abel's point, right? But when we begin to grasp it's no longer even unitive, you can see why it's wrong. Yes.
I guess I agree with that, and I kind of want to go back to like the notes of that woman where it's kind of like it seems like the husband was abusing her by not by doing it so much that it kind of it rejected her humanity in a sense.
Yes, so that we're going to talk about that in a minute. But essentially, it's just as wrong to use your wife for pleasure as it is to use her as like a baby making machine.
Mhm.
Right? It's just as wrong.
Mhm.
And so she was like, in that way, she was right. Like, that's what I was saying. Like the stories are not, I mean, they're not unbelievable, and it's a real problem. Like,
Is that covered in this?
Yes.
Like, where is it covered that? you
we're
can't-
gonna get
because
to it.
Seems like the whole purpose is for that function, so then.
Yeah, we're gonna get to it. So like 3 or 4 slides down, I think.
Okay.
Essentially, yeah, we'll talk about it when we get there. All right, so now let's sort of tie up some loose ends. All right, any questions on at least the gist of the arguments? You good now? You good? Yes. Okay. All right, so let's sort of tie up some of the arguments, or at least, and then answer some of the objections. So he does give a definition of contraception, which is important. And this is in paragraph 14. It says all direct abortion, even for therapeutic reasons, are to be absolutely excluded as lawful means of regulating the number of children, equally to be condemned, as the magisterium of the church has affirmed on many occasions, is direct sterilization, whether of the man or of the woman, whether permanent or temporary. Similarly excluded is any action, this is the definition of contraception, which either before, at the moment of, or after sexual intercourse is specifically intended to prevent procreation, whether as an end or as a means. Okay, so that is the definition. So any action which either before, at the moment of, or after, that's specifically intended to prevent procreation, whether as an end or as a means.
What does it mean, like, as an end or as a means? What is the as a means part getting at?
So yeah, so you could suppose I don't know, you needed so suppose you wanted to trying to think of a good example of a means. Suppose a man wanted to have his sperm count tested. And so right before during the act, he pulls out of his wife. And climaxes in a cup, not to be overly descriptive, but that would be a means, right? So it means to yes. Please don't ask me a question about that.
Lupus, your child will kill her. What do you do then?
All right, so ask your question in like 3 slides, and
Okay.
we'll answer.
He just wants to know what NP is.
Yeah, I know. He's chomping at the bit for NFP. We're almost there. We're almost there. Okay. So somebody help me out here though, because this is another sort of important piece, right? What do you guys think of the language here? Is he admitting of any exceptions to this?
If you're fasting from the moment where she's fertile. Did I describe that properly?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. You're looking at me.
Yeah. No, I was just looking at what you were saying. So this, I think, is an infallible statement. All right, so equally to be condemned, similarly excluded, those are definitive statements, right? Do they admit of any exceptions? No, right? And so you guys remember the 3 conditions for an infallible statement? Well, it has to be the Pope has to be teaching, right? And he has to be the act has to be as a teacher, as the universal teacher. It has to be directed at the entire church, right? And it has to be defined as irreformable, right? So he's done all 3 of those things, right? So yeah, earlier he definitely did. Yeah. Yes. Yes.
Where is he defining this as irreformable?
So I think that language of absolutely excluded, right? So absolutely excluded would mean no exceptions, right?
No, there's no wiggle room.
Yeah. So what,
He's not that's just making a universal statement, though, it's been a universal statement, so it's a rules.
yeah, I would say that if like this, those would be infallible. So in other words, like, so is that like the question of infallibility is a thing irreformable? So in other words, can it be otherwise? Is there any way that if something is absolutely excluded, could there ever be an exception to it?
If the statement is of the if the statement of absolute exclusion is true, but that's also what's in question, so.
Well, I mean, no, it's not in question in the sense of like, I understand why you're saying that, but it's not in question in the sense like he's authoritatively saying it because he's acting in an authoritative role, like in his role. And so if I say as father to my children, you are absolutely not permitted to boom, right? Is there any, like, do I have the authority to do that? Yes. Is there any exception to that? No, right? And that's the same principle, right? It's like, so I can understand, like, you may not necessarily accept the authority, but that's an exercise of the authority. In the sense of what? And maybe we can talk about it later if you don't like, I don't want to put you on the spot. Yeah. But the ultimately what it comes down to is like, okay, you can talk about whether he has the authority or not, but that's what an exercise of authority looks like. Just as if I said to Michael, you will absolutely not do this thing. Like that's a valid exercise of my authority. And he would still do the same thing he's doing, shaking his head no. But nevertheless. Okay. All right. So any questions on that? And like the infallibility of it is important. I think it's clear either way from that it's either like he keeps referring to but I do think that's an infallible statement. All right, so this will begin to start to answer some of your questions. The question of human procreation, like every other question which touches human life, involves more than the limited aspects specific to such disciplines as biology, psychology, demography, or sociology. It is the whole man and the whole mission to which he is called that must be considered, both its natural and earthly aspects and its supernatural eternal aspects. And since in the attempt to justify artificial methods of birth control, many appeal to the demands of married love or of responsible parenthood, these two important realities of married love must be accurately defined and analyzed. Okay, so what he's talking about here is, okay, we can't ignore the fact that there are numerous examples of sort of irresponsible parenthood, right? That's what those letters are, right? He's like, okay, we need to discuss this, right? And we need to talk about the demands of marital love, what you are called to do and what you have to do. Men rightly observe that a conjugal act imposed on one's partner without regard to his or her condition or personal and reasonable wishes in the matter is no true act of love, and therefore offends the moral order in its particular application to the intimate relationship of husband and wife. All right. So what he's saying is that a husband treating his wife that way repeatedly is not an act of love. In fact, not just repeatedly, but even once. All right. If they further reflect, they must also recognize that an act of mutual love, which impairs the capacity to transmit life, which God the Creator, through specific laws, has built into it, frustrates his design, which constitute the norm of marriage, and contradicts the will of the author of life. All right, so part of what he's talking about here is the fact that ultimately, one of the reasons that contraception is wrong is because it usurps God's design. Right, so now he's backing it up a little bit. that because God has built in times of infertility, that man ought to respect God's design. All right. And to respect and to cooperate with God's design is always a good thing. All right. And so this paragraph 13 is where
Is this like the first time like that anyone's ever spoken on it?
in an encyclical, yes. So Pius XII in some of his addresses did, but at this level sort of authority, yes.
I mean, because it's kind of weird for like, you to leave, like with Paul saying that like you have complete authority over the other person and then not expect anyone to ever abuse it for 1900 years.
No, that's fair. I mean, that's a fair, I think a fair statement. Yes.
Just on the note of Sanger, for what it's worth, the historian Rachel Wilson did numerous extensive works on why a lot of her letters were forged. I probably should have commented on
Yeah, that would have helped. Yeah.
Her most notorious case is there was one about a woman who claimed to have had to like use a hanger to do an abortion on herself 3 times. In the letter, she named the person, the location, and the doctors who were supposedly involved, and she went back and there were no existing medical records of this person existing.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and in truth, like, yeah. So, I don't necessarily want to like promote what she was saying, but she had a voice and a platform that it needed to be addressed. And there were enough people that at least were like, oh, that lady looks really overwhelmed by all the kids, right? But yeah, there were stories she had one story of a woman who had been married for 5 years and had 5 sets of twins. Like, that's really, really stretches belief, right? Yes.
I have a question regarding this, but it might be
Yeah.
a little off topic.
That's fine. There are no questions that are off topic.
Okay, so in the lens of other innovations, how do you know what will and what won't distort the creation? Like maybe you say, oh, humans can't fly, so airplanes obviously like humans shouldn't get airplanes, that goes against creation, or things like that.
Yeah, so it would be, I mean, again, it would depend on the situation. So what it would be, so humans can't fly. If I were to try to alter human nature such that like humans could actually fly and not in a plane, that would be wrong.
Okay.
Right. So it's normally in the sense of like the alteration is usually in the sense of a person, right? Like, and you alter the human person in some way.
It's also going back to like those 4 goods that we talked about, where like here in contraception of those 4 goods, state question and being in the planning about Australia and those 4 goods.
And so any technological sort of innovations should cooperate or heal human nature in some way.
Okay.
Right. And that's how you would that's actually how you would rate any sort of technology. Like, okay, does this, make virtue easier? Does this make, human nature thrive, or is it somehow contrary to human nature? And so like in that way, in fact, how he opens Humanae Vitae is actually with the discussion of technology, because he sees the pill as a sort of where technology has gone too far.
So if you get like a Neuralink, would that be good or bad?
Yeah, I would say that would be bad. That would be
Is
bad.
it bad?
Yeah.
Well, like if it restored your body to walk, would that not be like?
Well, I think but the problem would be, I think, well, the current plan for it, like again, like that it would go be,
Upload advertising?
yeah, it would go beyond, right? But in the sense of, say, it restores health in some way,
Yeah.
and that's all it did,
Okay.
right? Like, but that's not really all it does. Like, I mean, his plan is for me to be able to, share your emotions with me, right? Like where you're like, I'm sad. You're like, oh, really? And you're like, okay, feel it. And like, but like, suppose it's in some way enables the person to communicate or something.
Yeah.
That's restoring like a human good, a natural human good. That would be a good thing, right?
Okay.
And so like any medical sort of interventions that restore human nature are usually considered good, depending on, there could be a double effect there or something. But
do we have authority over our own body?
Yes, like only up to a certain point. Like you don't get to
Okay.
decide when to kill it.
Okay. Well, like, is plastic surgery or like stuff like that? Is that like in a gray area then, because it.
I would say if it's restorative, yes. If it's not, then it's mutilation.
Okay.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Wait, you know, a slide, please.
Okay.
Okay, so, without regard to the visitor's condition seems pretty obvious. But what about personal and reasonable?
I mean, it can just simply be,
Like, I'm tired.
yeah, that could be reasonable, right? Like, yeah.
Personal, just like, I don't.
No, yeah, I, I hesitate to like, cause it's deliberately broad so that it's not binding like in a,
So I guess what, because,
he's using personal in the sense of like, you should first care about the good of the person
yeah,
before you care about, scratching your itch. I think he means it personal in that sense. Rather than personal in the sense of like, I don't know, I've had a really rough day versus like I think it's personal more in the sense of like the good of the person.
they're gonna be other,
Yes. Yeah.
yeah, I guess it's that. Is
Like-
at what point?
Like in truth, right? Like a man, like he's watched his wife have a horrible day. Like a man shouldn't go to his wife and be like, "Hey, it's time to pay the debt."
Because it's meant to be sacrificial, so like at one point, is it,
Yeah, and that's why it's not like if she was doing that every day, like then there might be a different question. Like then there's a different issue, right? So I think that's why he's not giving like a list, right? Um, I guess a little blunt. Sorry, I didn't know any other way to put it.
There had to be some other way than.
Well, it's a biblical term. This at some point this discussion was going to get awkward for you anyway. Let's just yeah, sorry. All right, other questions. Okay. All right. What about the fact one of the objections is that it was too hard, just asking too much. Okay. Self-discipline of this kind is a shining witness to the chastity of husband and wife, and far from being a hindrance to their love of one another, transforms it by giving it more truly human character. And if this self-discipline does demand that they persevere in their purpose and efforts, it has the same time their salutary effect of enabling husband and wife to develop to their personalities and to be enriched with spiritual blessings. Okay, so one of the things that will come out of theology of the body is the capacity for all of us to take the one flesh union between man and wife literally. All right, and to understand it, right? So go back to your question earlier about the woman with lupus. What better way for a man to share in the suffering of her lupus than to share in the consequences of her lupus, which may be abstaining for long periods of time, right? That's
What do you do, but if she accidentally gets pregnant and you know she's gonna die? Like, but you could, like, what do you do then? Like, do you
you know the story of Saint John of Mola?
no.
So she is the answer to your question.
Okay.
So again, like that happens is tragic. Doesn't happen very often, and probably way less often now. But you would hope that the woman, like any parent, would give the life for her child, right?
Okay.
And so now there are modalities that they can do to try to save the mother.
What if you know the baby's not gonna survive, but both of them are not gonna survive?
So how you remedy that matters,
Uh-huh.
right? So you couldn't kill the baby so that the mom could survive.
Uh-huh.
But could you
So
ever
it's
really
also
know
worth
the
noting
baby's
that
not?
this is not like regularly fatal.
Yeah, I think he was just using it as a gap. I don't think he was. Yeah.
I know all like the life purposes like time.
Yeah.
And the big differentiation is whether you're treating like one patient or two.
Mhm.
So like if there's a situation where the mom is like, she's dying, we need to get the baby out right now,
Mhm.
baby's 21 weeks, we don't know what's gonna live.
Mhm.
You can take the baby out, but there's a difference between taking the baby out and like leaving them on a table
Mhm.
to die versus giving the baby every life-saving like
Mhm.
procedure you can give.
Mhm.
And so like I've always tried to explain like that, like that's the main difference, is if you're coming in with like two patients, there's a like there's the mom, and then there's this like afterthought of like the baby. And then I think it's that, I think in today's society, you think of death, and that's the end of it. But the hope of the Christian life is for eternal life, so it would actually be better for the baby to be delivered early and baptized, because then you know that baby's had, since that is the receipt that's had baptism. And that's better than just, have basically aborting the baby.
What were you gonna say, bro?
So, I don't know, maybe I'm not understanding correctly, but if the mom is to die to save the kid, if like that's like the ideal where there's, you know, one or the other. Then I'm kind of thinking of like from the perspective of like self-defense. Like, doesn't that mean that I should technically like, you know, if it was a case of someone who's about to kill me, shouldn't I, or I could kill them?
Yeah, self-defense only works in the face of an aggressor, though, right? Like the baby is not an aggressor.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Is, in the case we were speaking of earlier, is medically reduced labor to save the mother and just try to have child be born prematurely? Is that not a violation of natural law, because the medically reduced labor is not something that would otherwise naturally occur? And if you're doing it at a time period where you don't know where the child will certainly survive, then you're giving up the child's life for the mother. So I'd like to get your thoughts.
Yeah, so I think the example is, I think the example of the mother's going to die. Right? And so the only way to possibly save the child is to induce labor.
Actually, don't.
Yeah, whatever, like, yeah, whatever. Yeah. No, it doesn't matter. You're
Inducing would cause more distress on both the baby and the mom.
They're both equally non-natural medical procedures.
Yeah, so that's where you don't use natural in that way, right? Because it's also like natural is that which was in accord with human nature itself. Don't use it in the sense of like nature, in the sense of like, oh, you don't see this out in nature. So what you're doing is actually restoring health. You're restoring health back to its natural state, which in and of itself requires some artificial intervention. Artificial in the sense of like you have to use your hands in some way, right? So what is the goal of all of that? It's to restore life, right? Not to take life. And so all kinds of like medical interventions, by your definition, would be unnatural. But that's not what natural, like when we use like natural law, we don't mean it in that way. We mean it in the sense of like, okay, what is it that will restore human nature to its full flourishing?
Speaker says I was referring to a means not established by God. It doesn't make us artificially established by God.
Right. Yeah, but so that's what I mean. It's not, so that's just a means to restore human nature, right? So like where would you draw the line between, like, you see what I'm saying? Like where would you draw the line between what's okay and what's not then?
Right. I'm not advocating for, I'm merely stating that I'm using the different reference of the same word to describe the situation and ask them about the moral.
Yeah, so okay, I sort of understand what you're saying. So when it's a means where the end is restoring human nature to whatever it is, right? Okay, that's where you're sort of looking at okay, am I doing something that is natural? Am I restoring nature, or am I enhancing it? Whatever. But the point is, okay, that's the end I'm choosing. Okay, what means am I going to use? Now we're free to use any sort of morally licit means in the sense of like, which includes sort of artificial interventions, as long as they're not in some way like indicative of like some other grave evil, like in a double effect kind of way. And so just the fact that like a C-section is seemingly unnatural, right? It's just the means so that a child can naturally be born, like so that human nature the child can survive. And so therefore it's a good thing. right? But if I used a C-section to abort the child, it would be a bad thing. So the means in a certain sense is neutral until you decide what it's being used for. Does that make sense? Okay. I got a little sidetracked there. The other sort of accusation is not only is hard, but it also sort of kills spontaneity. Right? What's the problem with that one?
Spontaneity is a public intrinsic good.
Well, what does spontaneity sort of imply?
That's natural.
It's out of your control.
Yeah, it's like I'm not under control, right? Like, we're sitting there and I'm like, oh, I just got a little, itch here. I need to scratch and like just spontan, let's go. Whereas virtue requires what? Forethought and a strong will, right? And so spontaneity is not necessarily a good thing in that way, right? It should be thought at. When you have to reflect, virtue grows. All right, sort of, let me see what I have left. Okay, let's talk about how NFP is different. All right, when couples, by means of recourse to contraception, separate these two meanings as the unitive and procreative that God the Creator has inscribed in the being of man and woman, and then the dynamism of their sexual communion, they act as arbiters of the divine plan, and they manipulate and integrate human sexuality, and with it themselves and their married partner by altering its value of total self-giving. Okay, so that's all sort of stuff we've talked about. This leads not only to a positive refusal to be open to life, but also to a falsification of the inner truth of the conjugal love, which is called upon to give itself in personal totality. When instead, by means of recourse to periods of infertility, the couple respect the inseparable connection between the unitive and procreative meanings of human sexuality. They are acting as ministers of God's plan, and they benefit from their sexuality according to the original dynamism of total self-giving without manipulation or alteration. Okay, so what is he talking about? So what he's trying to sort of get at is, okay, how is NFP different from contraception? All right, it's important to sort of grasp this, right? So first, let's say it's used in order to avoid pregnancy. Okay, is the end the same? Right, the end in both cases, right? To avoid pregnancy. Okay. Now, am I free to choose any means possible to accomplish that end? No, you would agree, no, right? Like, okay. So that's in one way in which they're different. They're different means, right? The other thing is they're actually different actions. All right, and this is where people get confused. NFP is not an action. It's, I guess I would call it a philosophy. Because when we can only measure the moral quality of an action. Okay. So I have the intention of avoiding pregnancy. All right. My action is to not have sex. Is that good, reasonable, and okay? As far as you know right now, yes, right? My intention is to avoid pregnancy. My proposed object is to have sex. Is that a good, reasonable thing to do? No, right? Okay, so the point is that in NFP, you're not actually doing anything, right? You're choosing not to have sex to avoid pregnancy, whereas with contraception, you were choosing to have sex to avoid pregnancy. Okay, and those two things don't fit together. Yes?
Is the planning an action?
I don't think so. Like if you go to the sort of classic, okay, what is the object, the intent, and the circumstances? Right? So what is the object?
The action of planning?
Yeah, but just having the plan, I don't know, how do I compare a plan with an action?
Well, I'm talking about the verb.
Okay, yes,
The object of planning is the plan.
So maybe the only problem with doing that though is now I've lost the parallel between a contraceptive act versus no act, right? So I'm trying to. I agree with you that a plan is an act in that sense, but Now I've lost the ability to compare the two, right? Which is what I'm trying to do. Does that make sense?
No, I don't.
Okay, so, all right, so I want to avoid pregnancy. All right, and so I'm going to choose two different ways to do that. Not have sex and have contraceptive sex. So those are my two objects, two things I'm going to do. You see the difference?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's all I'm trying to sort of establish, that they have the same intention, but the objects that you're choosing to actually carry out the intention are vastly different.
I understand the intention and why you're creating that I think, but the reason I was asking about whether or not the plan qualifies as an action was because in the statement that you said was infallible earlier, that you showed us that was defining when it was wrong, says any action that is done. And if the word used was action with the intent of avoiding the procreative purpose, the act of planning is an action, and its intention is to avoid the procreative end, which is the creation of a child. So I don't understand how under the very strict definition I was given earlier, the infallible statement, how the action of planning, the intent to impede procreation.
Well, so it doesn't impede, right? It doesn't impede,
It's just not.
right? So you've done nothing to impede it, right? That's just her natural state.
Well, now you're using natural in the earlier definition, which is the normal course that was established by God.
Let's go back to if I can find it. You remember which slide it was on? Is it here?
Yeah.
Any action which either before, at the moment, or after is specifically intended to prevent procreation.
So
Yeah, it's describing those things in reference to the sexual act, right? So
the action that is occurring before the sexual intercourse is the planning. The planning is specifically intended to prevent procreation.
If it's referring to the actual act itself.
so if you're planning.
Yeah, so remember, the act is sexual intercourse. That's why I used the example I did. Right? So have you done anything to prevent procreation?
Because it's talking about intimate sexual intercourse.
Yeah, you're not planning
In the act.
before sexual intercourse.
Yeah, so I haven't, I didn't prevent, how does that prevent procreation? I mean,
You're planning to do intercourse at a time where there's a lower fertility.
but you've done nothing to prevent it. You see what I'm saying, right?
Well, it says intended.
But
The
it's-
intention is to prevent.
Yeah,
It's not about whether you
It's
actually.
well, it's in reference to the sexual intercourse. So if you're not even having.
No, it's referring to a time period in reference to the sexual intercourse. So it says before, at, or after sexual intercourse.
Yeah, but
That
that
is,
didn't even occur. Sexual intercourse didn't even occur.
Yeah, the point is that,
you're planning when to have
It's
it.
in reference to like specific actions, right?
yeah, that's what I was trying to say, and that's why NFP is an idea or a philosophy. The actual acts are the acts of sexual intercourse themselves. So I did, if I don't have sex, I didn't have sex. It's not talking about, it's talking about the act of sexual intercourse. So every act of sexual intercourse has to can have nothing that is intended to prevent procreation. So it's the act itself, the individual acts. Right, and so not having it doesn't count as an act of sexual intercourse. Abstaining isn't having it. You see what I'm saying?
I just don't understand where you're getting the narrow definition of action, how you're narrowing down action.
Okay, so when the woman is fertile, okay, so suppose I made a plan. When the woman is fertile and I don't have intercourse with her, what have I done anything wrong? I haven't done anything to prevent procreation other than, I guess if we go with your definition, I should have sex like 24/7.
Right,
Yeah.
I.
So-
I guess
so-
what I'm saying is-
So probably you're probably reading it, you're probably reading it too literally then, right?
Yeah, I guess that's what I'm saying, is
Yeah.
that seems like a consequence of taking that statement.
But I think it's more of the message.
Actions are discrete within one sentence.
Yeah, so you have to look at actions, yeah, that's a good point. You have to look at individual actions, right? You can't morally judge like just everything, like you judge individual actions.
But that would mean to say that there's not a nature to this, because when you're talking about human nature, you're talking about
No, but
a universal, and you're judging the universal. And so I don't see why you, like, when you're judging contraception, you're judging all actions of contraception.
Yeah, because you can't take any single act and make it morally right.
I think that the plan for NFP, right, the P, comes with a caveat that if I practice NFP and I do become pregnant, I accept that like an open, right? It might not have been my intention, but the plan part encompasses the fact that if I were to get pregnant, I'm keeping that life and protecting that life with everything I have versus contraception. You're saying I renounce life at all stages. I'm doing that before I choose to use contraception and during the act and afterwards, basically. Like that's why the philosophy part comes with a plan where it's like I may not want to be pregnant, but I will still accept life. And that's why you're not impeding procreation. Because mentally you're saying, I will still accept this idea if I am not.
the systematic way of thinking about it would be that, like, when referencing a little more like how the catechism talks about judging the morality of human actions, some things are always intrinsically wrong, like contraception. So we can roll those out like as a category. But for something that's not intrinsically wrong, that is good in nature, it can be wrong. It can be good or bad based on the intention in the specific act. And so to evaluate that, you have to look at those discrete actions within time and the specific intentions and at those times associated with those actions. You can't judge a category of actions by a discrete intention within time.
So there are certain, so to sum up what he just said, there are certain actions that are intrinsically wrong, always wrong. And then there's some actions that may or may not be wrong depending on the circumstances and the intention. Right? So murder is always wrong, regardless of the circumstances or intention, right? Picking up a woman and carrying her across the street depends on my intention and the circumstances. If I'm picking her up to kidnap her, would be wrong. If I'm picking her up because she's about to get hit by a bus, it's good, right? So that's his point, is that certain things are always wrong no matter what your intention and your circumstances are. But other things, you have to look at the circumstances and intentions. Because in that sense, the object itself is relative to those. Does that make sense? All right, last slide. So NFP is not just sort of Catholic birth control. In the sense that you can practice NFP with a contraceptive mentality. So in other words, you should only be avoiding pregnancy for just reasons. Okay. And the church does not give us a list of just reasons. But the point is that you have to have good reasons for avoiding pregnancy. Yes.
When you say just, you mean like Aristotle, meaning just?
Yes, I think that's the best way to look at it. Yes. So in other words, that you owe, something like, so in other words, like it just makes it clearer. I don't know. It would be unjust for the husband of that woman who has 5 sets of twins to insist she get pregnant again next year. Right. It would be unjust to, I don't know, to my children that I already have, that if I couldn't take care of them, to have more children. But if I had to give up my guitar playing on Wednesday nights, that's not a just reason to avoid pregnancy, right? So that's the point, right? The church doesn't give us a list of them. It's kind of left to personal discernment. But I do think the word just actually helps, because you have to have sort of just reasons as to why you're avoiding pregnancy. All right. Any questions?